From Roswell rumors to modern radar data, UAP sightings have fueled speculation for decades. But in 2025, the landscape has shifted. Congress and oversight committees have expanded reporting requirements, created investigative bodies, and directed funding streams toward UAP study. Alongside this, the government established the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, while NASA launched its own independent UAP study team, signaling that the subject moved firmly into official channels. What drives these extraordinary steps remains uncertain. There is evidence, denials, and open questions. This video explains what is verified, what remains allegation, and why one intelligence officer now sits at the center of it. Who is David Grusch now? In 2023, David Grusch emerged as one of the most visible figures in the UAP debate, not as an anonymous source or journalist, but as a decorated intelligence officer directly stepping into the public eye. That year, he filed a whistleblower complaint through official channels, asserting that secret programs had long concealed retrieved craft and technology of non-human origin. What gave weight to this action was not only his career as a military and intelligence professional, but also the Inspector General of the intelligence community's assessment that his complaint was both credible and urgent. That judgment elevated his claims from rumor to a matter Congress could not easily ignore. At the same time, the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office repeatedly stated it had found no evidence of such crash retrieval or reverse engineering programs, presenting the public with two sharply conflicting perspectives. Grusch's standing to make such allegations rests on a resume much different from the average UFO commentator. He entered service with a background in physics, became an officer in the U.S. Air Force, and later worked as an intelligence professional tasked with analyzing scientific and technical information. In those roles, he gained clearance to handle some of the most sensitive data in government. Eventually, he became associated with the UAP task force, where his job was to assess encounters that defied conventional explanation. This positioned him uniquely. He was not a civilian gathering second-hand reports, but a government insider reviewing classified materials and testimony. For an issue long dismissed as fringe, his credentials provided a rare bridge into official territory. When he went public, the scope of his allegations quickly distinguished him from past whistleblowers. He described what he understood as a multi-decade effort to recover and reverse engineer non-human technology, with even references to so-called non-human biologics tied to these retrievals. These were and remain his allegations, statements he insists come from classified briefings and interviews with dozens of colleagues. They stretch far beyond lights in the sky or unexplained videos. They raise the possibility of physical evidence, hardware, and biological data. That scale of claim drew immediate skepticism from parts of the defense establishment and from many scientists. They argued such revelations would be nearly impossible to keep secret for decades if genuine. Still, the very fact he anchored them in sworn testimony underpinned their reach. The institutional response has been split. On one side, the Intelligence Community Inspector General formally affirmed that his underlying complaint warranted urgent review. That determination carries weight because it means his testimony was not dismissed outright within classified oversight. On the other side, AARO, the Department of Defense, and NASA all issued public statements saying they had found no trace of programs matching his descriptions. For outside observers, this creates a paradox. One arm of oversight validated the seriousness of his disclosure, while other agencies flatly rejected the substance of it. That unresolved contradiction continues to fuel debate about his reliability and about how much of the truth sits locked away in classified compartments. In the 2 years since he first testified, Grusch has remained active. He is no longer only a whistleblower on headlines. He now provides briefings and discussions with congressional staff, consults with some lawmakers, and participates in classified sessions where permitted. He does not hold a formal congressional advisory title, yet his persistence has kept him in the circle of people shaping how the issue of UAPs is debated inside government. That persistence alone is unusual. Historically, whistleblowers on topics like this have been shut out of policy, often seeing their careers end the moment they speak publicly. Grusch, in contrast, managed to transition into a semi-consultative role, with his background continuing to attract attention even as critics dispute his conclusions. For those watching his journey, what stands out is how normalized his presence has become within official debate. A subject once ridiculed as science fiction now features input from a former intelligence professional testifying under oath to recovered technology programs. Members of Congress reference his statements in hearings and cite his testimony as part of the justification for mandating further transparency. Even without a formal appointment, his willingness to brief, answer questions, and interpret the culture of secrecy surrounding UAPs makes him a figure institutions repeatedly return to. That is a significant change from a time when UFO claims were dismissed outright in Washington. Despite this, Grusch remains polarizing. Supporters highlight his stature, his access to classified reporting, and the Inspector General's credibility ruling. Skeptics emphasize the lack of verifiable physical evidence presented to the public and note the explicit denials from Pentagon and NASA investigations. To them, a single officer's allegations cannot overturn decades of official statements or substitute for direct material proof. This tension makes him both an influential and contested player, a man some see as a brave insider risking reputation, and others describe as misled or overstating. The reality is that Grusch has carved out a role no one else occupies, an intersection of insider authority and outsider controversy. He continues to appear in briefings, maintains contact with lawmakers, and shapes how oversight bodies frame the UFO discussion. At the same time, the government's most visible research bodies continue to counter his claims with their own findings. This unresolved dynamic ensures his name remains at the center of debate, while larger questions about secrecy, verification, and oversight remain unsettled. His persistence also underscores a deeper change inside the system. Congress is willing not only to hear claims like his, but fold them into hearings, legislation, and new investigative offices. This represents a departure from past decades when insiders who spoke out were more likely to face silencing and invitation. Grusch may not hold a title of congressional advisor, but his repeated briefings show officials are at least open to factoring his perspective into their oversight. That institutional willingness is as much a story as his own allegations. The path Grusch has taken, from officer to whistleblower to public witness, and now to an active voice consulted by members of Congress, illustrates not just one man's trajectory but a systemic shift in how claims about UAPs are handled. Where figures in his position were once isolated or sidelined, he is now part of the conversation shaping the government's next steps. This development sets the stage for one of the most significant factors influencing whether others will follow. Because for insiders considering whether to speak about UAP programs, the real question is no longer just whether their story will be heard, but whether they will be protected once they tell it. The biggest change: legal protections for whistleblowers. For those who consider speaking out today, the key difference compared to earlier generations is the presence of formal legal channels. This brings us to the biggest shift in recent years. Congress has begun creating explicit protections for whistleblowers willing to discuss UAP-related programs. For decades, the largest deterrent was not the content of claims, but the price paid afterward. Former officials who spoke publicly often lost their security clearances or saw once promising careers quietly end. Even in closed-door briefings, many hesitated to approach oversight committees, fearing retaliation by agencies or contractors responsible for guarding compartmented projects. The pattern was consistent. The silence was enforced not just by secrecy agreements, but by the personal and professional cost inflicted on those who chose to break them. By the early 2020s, only rare figures such as Grusch were willing to accept those burdens. That environment began to change after his testimony in 2023. Pressure built from journalists, advocacy groups, and several lawmakers who believed the system needed reform. They argued accountability suffered when insiders had no way to speak openly without destroying their careers. By late 2023 and into 2024, Congress responded by strengthening reporting procedures and embedding whistleblower-related provisions into the annual defense authorization process. Lawmakers debated language partly modeled on earlier declassification frameworks, framing new avenues for those with sensitive knowledge of UAP activity to present it to oversight channels. The legislative push did not end with a single law, but evolved across fiscal years, continuing to expand into FY 2025. The statutory outcome was not a blanket amnesty or an open press conference. Rather, Congress outlined circumstances in which whistleblowers could carry classified or otherwise restricted information into secure committee settings. Civil groups clarified this pathway, pointing out that disclosures still needed to follow specific procedures, but could now bring sensitive content into the record without automatically triggering penalties for unauthorized release. In theory, the message was clear. A contractor, scientist, or intelligence officer could approach investigators with information under formal legal cover. In practice, however, protections did not eliminate all forms of reprisal. Real-world cases still involved loss of assignments, delayed promotions, or strained professional relations, even where the law affirmed protections. The difference is that insulated channels now exist. For example, Grusch's own initial complaint was reviewed by the Intelligence Community Inspector General, who designated it both urgent and credible. That precedent made it harder for others in government to dismiss the seriousness of future disclosures. Parallel to that, nonprofit legal groups working pro bono began offering counsel to those considering testifying. Together, these changes lowered the temperature around the act of speaking up, even if they did not erase the risks entirely. Two practical takeaways emerge from this shift. First, Congress has provided clearer legal corridors that allow those with direct UAP-related knowledge to go before oversight bodies in a structured way, something almost impossible to imagine during earlier decades. Second, while those protections exist, they are still imperfect. Retaliation may be reduced, but it has not vanished, and individuals who come forward must still weigh career consequences. These are not theoretical concerns. Advocates note instances where service members cited subtle forms of professional pushback even after acting within new rules. The law sets ground cover, it does not guarantee safety. The presence of these protections nonetheless alters the balance of testimony. For much of the 20th century, stories about crash retrievals or anomalous craft remained confined to anonymous leaks or retired officers speaking long after leaving service. Now, in theory, those with decades of direct program involvement could brief committees while still active, providing contemporaneous accounts instead of filtered memories. Legislators themselves pointed out this advantage: more verifiable testimony, fewer ghost stories. For oversight institutions, this is a significant recalibration. Of course, critics remain skeptical. Some worry that new protections might encourage exaggeration, knowing that whistleblowers are less likely to face immediate dismissal or legal sanction. Others argue lawmakers are diverting resources toward what they still view as fringe ideas, distracting from more pressing defense needs. Yet the fact remains that legislative frameworks now exist. UAP testimony is no longer limited to the fringes of public debate. For Congress, once a venue that brushed aside such matters, the process of hearing and evaluating these accounts is now routine. The act of listening has itself legitimized the record. The contrast to the past is striking. Well into the late 20th century, insiders who spoke out often disappeared into public obscurity, their accounts surviving only in scattered publications or radio interviews. Today, the same categories of claims, no matter how controversial, enter into official transcripts and closed session notes. Even skeptics acknowledge that this represents a structural break from decades of blanket denial. Whatever one thinks of the claims themselves, the government has given them a formal path. The stakes are considerable. If an aerospace engineer reports exposure to unfamiliar materials, protections now allow presenting that information to oversight without immediately sacrificing a career. If an intelligence officer claims knowledge of programs involving unusual craft under custody, mechanisms exist to record and examine the account. These steps do not resolve questions of truth or verification, but they alter the ground rules of disclosure. Instead of shaping narratives through leaks and rumor, testimony is captured within legal frameworks, documented for potential follow-up. In effect, Congress has taken away secrecy's easiest weapon, fear of reprisal as a deterrent, yet it has not transformed whistleblowing into a risk-free endeavor. Careers, reputations, and relationships still hang in the balance for those who step forward. The outcome is a hybrid environment, safer than before, but never entirely secure. That middle ground is where the debate now sits, as leaders decide whether testimony is credible enough to drive further investigation. What matters most is that insiders today face a different calculation than at any point in recent history. Retaliation remains possible, but doors once welded shut are now at least partly open. Claims about UAPs can leave the margins and enter the official record. That transformation in turn set the stage for another practical shift. Lawmakers were no longer content with hearings and legal scaffolding alone. They were prepared to invest tangible support and resources into the issue. What Congress is funding in 2025. In 2025, lawmakers have moved beyond hearings and testimony by committing actual funding to the UAP issue. Instead of assigning staff to temporary reviews, Congress is writing allocations into Appropriations and Defense Authorization, ensuring the subject is addressed within the machinery of government. This is not a single earmark labeled crash retrievals, but a broad set of budget lines directed to oversight bodies, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, archival review projects, and laboratory access for testing reported materials. Funding is now part of the baseline conversation, a structural presence rather than a passing discussion. AARO alone has been processing hundreds of new reports, with the office publicly noting that between mid-2023 and mid-2024, It received about 757 fresh incident cases and had reviewed over 1,600 in total by the end of 2024. Those figures underline why Congress sees the need for resources. The volume is no longer negligible. This approach reflects a shift in tone. For years, the idea of UFO investigations in federal budgets seemed unthinkable. Now, appropriations create the backbone for methodical review, moving the subject out of speculative space and into institutional processes. Legislative amendments over 2023 and 2024, including UAP-related provisions attached to the NDAA and even elements of the UAP Disclosure Act language, reinforce this by requiring agencies to preserve records, review classified holdings, and standardize reporting. In practice, this means Congress is not funding a confirmed crash program, but is instead channeling money to the infrastructure that could verify or disprove such claims through proper oversight and science. Part of that infrastructure lies in analysis. Select laboratories with high security clearance and material science expertise are being granted funding to examine candidate samples reportedly linked to UAP sightings or incidents. The mandate is straightforward. Take what has until now circulated as extraordinary claims and subject it to empirical testing with advanced tools like isotopic analysis and nanostructure spectroscopy. Parliamentarians stress that this investment is less about confirming mythology and more about generating hard data. If unusual alloys or isotope ratios emerge, they can be documented. If nothing remarkable is found, the record is equally valuable for closing claims. Lawmakers also defend this spending by pointing out that material analysis can benefit aerospace and defense research regardless of outcome. Access to such labs remains tightly controlled, though, and the classification of potential samples continues to limit transparency. In parallel, Congressional Appropriations are supporting archival research and declassification projects. Large portions of mid-20th century defense files remain scattered or sealed, with interagency competition keeping them locked away. Funding in 2025 is enabling cleared staff to consolidate and review those archives to determine whether references to unusual materials or recovery operations appear in procurement records, contracts, or program ledgers. Unlike the ad hoc efforts of journalists or private researchers, this process is systematic and government-backed. The task is considerable, decades of files must be compiled, but the work is underway in a way it never consistently was before. The significance of attaching funds is straightforward. It builds continuity. When appropriations exist, staff are obligated to dedicate time, file progress reports, and keep offices active. This injects stability into what was once a volatile, media-driven debate. Investigations that might previously have faded within months are now structured as multi-year efforts with resources behind them. Skeptics in Washington acknowledge that whether the results vindicate or debunk sensational claims, the institutional process itself has expanded. The subject is no longer episodic. Still, funding the issue has not come without contest. Critics inside and outside Congress warn that appropriations represent a misallocation. Commentators emphasize that UFO inquiries have a record of yielding little definitive evidence despite decades of attention. Some argue that scarce defense dollars should flow to established threats like cyber warfare, hypersonic weapons, or missile defense rather than what they describe as fringe topics. Opinion editorials and budget watchdogs echo this, warning oversight could transform into expensive wheels spinning with few practical gains. Lawmakers counter that ignoring the possibility of advanced technology in U.S. custody might itself be irresponsible if testimonies prove valid. The eruption of debate reflects how UAPs have entered the mainstream of policy disputes once reserved for conventional security matters. In weighing these disagreements, congressional leaders have attempted to reframe funding rationales. Appropriations are emphasized not as money for flying saucers, but as investments in aerospace safety, airspace monitoring, and the proper handling of unidentified activity near sensitive facilities. Framed this way, budget lines become components of national security policy. Similarly, as seen with laboratory testing, the outputs are defined as dual use, insights that bolster broader defense research even if exotic origins are never validated. These arguments are presented as pragmatic, with leaders noting that the dollars involved remain a small fraction of the massive defense budget as a whole. What makes 2025 stand apart is less the scale of the money than its intent. For the first time, UAP oversight has an enduring budget rubric behind it. Offices like AARO are now fully funded to continue case review, incident logging, and coordination with agencies, rather than operating on minimal interim resources. Oversight committees can assign professional staff specifically to monitor compliance and track disclosures. Archival declassification can proceed systematically rather than as discretionary gestures. These mechanisms knit together a process that can outlast individual political cycles. The impact is already visible in congressional reports. Committees now receive scheduled updates on how AARO is progressing, how many cases have been logged, and how archival review is proceeding. These deliverables mean the issue cannot easily vanish when news interest declines. The bureaucratic pipeline forces consistent attention. Importantly, this does not resolve whether extraordinary claims, recovered craft, or non-human technology will ever be substantiated. But it does mean any such claims are being subjected to a more serious form of institutional testing than in the past. For advocates of disclosure, that is progress. For budget skeptics, it is costly repetition of experiments that history suggests will produce little. Regardless of perspective, the fact remains that governmental resources are now tied to an issue once ignored. That shift produces tangible outcomes. Archival records are being cataloged, laboratories are equipped to test unusual samples, and AARO is processing hundreds of incidents under sustained funding. Whether the ultimate findings affirm or dismiss the extraordinary rumors, the UAP question is set to produce a durable official archive rather than scattered anecdotes. There is, however, an unresolved tension underneath this new order. Public language in budgets emphasizes safety, oversight, and scientific evaluation, yet much of the testimony that spurred action focuses on deeper allegations that actual recovery programs have existed for decades. As appropriations fuel broader inquiries, attention turns toward whether any of these testimonies intersect with verifiable records of clandestine operations. The question is no longer whether Congress is taking action, but what those actions may ultimately unearth from the classified margins. The secretive crash retrieval programs. Among the most debated allegations in recent testimony are those of secretive crash retrieval programs. For years, stories of recovered wreckage, stored artifacts, and hidden projects circulated in speculation, but by 2025 they carry new weight because insiders with intelligence and military credentials have repeated them in official settings. Figures such as David Grusch and others have asserted that classified programs exist to recover and study what they describe as non-human technology. Yet against these claims stands a consistent public message from the Pentagon and the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. No verifiable evidence has been found to support assertions that the U.S. government or its contractors hold or are reverse engineering extraterrestrial materials. This tension between striking whistleblower testimony and firm official denial is what drives congressional interest. The allegations themselves follow a recognizable pattern. Witnesses say that, if crash retrievals have occurred, the materials were not necessarily stored inside government warehouses where oversight would be straightforward. Instead, they allege custody has sometimes fallen to defense contractors under specialized classified contracts. In this structure, compartmentalization makes tracing details difficult even for oversight personnel. Critics of secrecy argue this kind of contractor arrangement could explain how unusual programs might continue largely hidden, while skeptics maintain the lack of public documentation suggests misinterpretation or exaggeration. At present, these claims remain unverified. Congress has responded by directing inquiries into defense procurement records and contract trails to test whether such allegations withstand scrutiny. Another recurring point is the question of duration. Some insiders have suggested recovery operations may have been occurring for decades, stretching back into the mid-20th century. These statements are allegations, not documented history. They remain uncorroborated in the public record. Supporters of disclosure argue that secrecy over long spans would not be unprecedented, citing past concealed programs in nuclear weapons development or signals intelligence. Critics counter that the longer the claimed concealment, the less likely it would remain airtight. In either frame, Congress is now pressing the timeline issue, seeking to confirm or refute whether any recovery-related references survive in archived budget documents or legacy contracts. Lawmakers also recognize the implications if corporate custody is even partly accurate. If defense contractors, rather than government laboratories, held pieces of extraordinary material, then responsibility for access and use could sit with corporate executives and boards rather than elected leaders. This dynamic raises concerns about accountability and intellectual property. If hypothetically technologies from unusual artifacts were developed, what safeguards would exist to prevent them from being privatized rather than disclosed? Allegations of contractor custody therefore pose not only national security questions, but also legal and regulatory ones. Importantly, no specific contract names or corporate entities have been confirmed in public, which is why Congress has focused resources on combing through contract structures, non-disclosure agreements, and procurement ledgers. As multiple whistleblowers repeat similar themes, recovered craft, contractor involvement, compartmentalized programs, the impact is cumulative.